Today, we're in spooky season mode again, leading up to Halloween and All Saints Day, All Hallows Eve. Today, we're talking about indulgences. And that's enough to make a lot of the reformers quake. And that is a spooky word, but it's definitely a concept that's very misunderstood. It was misunderstood back in the Middle Ages, and it's misunderstood today. So it'd be cool to delve into that a little bit, maybe see if we can get a better understanding of that. But before we get into that, we want to paint a little bit of the scene and why it's relevant to spooky season. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Pinedo Brothers Podcast. I'm your host, Peter, and I've got with me my brother right here.
Hey, I'm JP.
JP in the house. All right. Well, we're glad that you're here with us. We're the Pinedo Brothers, Catholic filmmaking artists who are working to revitalize the world of Catholic art through films about faith, not just faith films. So Indulgences kind of came, let's take it back to maybe the 1300s. All right. And this is the early Middle Ages. Middle Ages are, things started to really kick into gear for Europe around, the 1100s. There was a rapid development. The Crusades were happening, and culture was really starting to reach a high point in the Middle Ages here. And then you have this incredible travesty and just this horrific plague that sweeps through the land. It comes on a boat from probably around the region of Turkey and the Black Sea. And this is, of course, the Black Plague. And if you're thinking about, this was a pandemic, this was of worldwide proportions and it affected everybody. But if you're thinking about pandemics as we think of them today with COVID, you're not even nearly in the remote ballpark of what we're talking about. This is an actual plague that decimated towns, villages, cities, and just completely leveled the entire European society. So it kicked back European society, I would say, hundreds of years because of just how it ravaged society. The Black Plague, it had a tendency to cause these boils on you, these huge black boils. And pretty soon you wouldn't be able to see or hear, or really it would send you into this state of complete delirium where you were just hallucinating. And it's a horrifying, completely terrible way to die. And after you died, your body would your skin just turned black. And so that's where it got the name, the Black Plague, also known as the Black Death. So this is the real deal. Very scary. Yeah. Are you familiar? I know there's a lot. I could paint you all these different stories with the Black Plague. What do you know about the good old Black Death?
Well, Poe sets the feeling quite right in a lot of his short stories where he calls it more the Red Death. There's a short story called The Red Death, but it kind of gets the point across where if it gets in, everybody dies, and that's what Poe, obviously that's a little bit of an exaggeration. 1 in 3 people die. That's bad enough as it is,
we're looking at estimates earlier. I think it was saying that 25 million people died, which would be 1 in 3 people in Europe at that time. So, right. And massive scale.
And just to put that in a little bit of perspective. So first of all, imagine 1 in 3 people in your family dying, but then also picture the fact that if that happened to us, our society probably does not, the United States does not last. We went through a pandemic where I think how many people was it? 1 in, I think 200,000 people died, and we shut down everything, and we still are not sure if our economy is going to survive. Our economy might not survive. The worldwide economy might not survive from what we did over COVID. So imagine if that happened and your economy, not just your economy is decimated, but your ability to come back, to rebuild is decimated because all the people are dead. That it showed the fact that Europe was able to actually survive, that there's still a culture after this, is a testament to the fact that it's not just human means behind it. There was these Europeans were made of stronger stuff than what we are now. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's definitely a hardiness to them to be able to come back from that. But of course, it leaves this incredible mark on society. I mean, there are stories that I've learned of just entire towns being completely wiped out. There was this monk in Ireland who so it would affect different areas kind of differently. Because different kinds of people were a little bit more prone, a little bit less prone to the disease. So there was this monk in Ireland who he was in a monastery where everybody died, like his entire monastery died. And then everybody in the surrounding town died. And he was just literally roaming from town to town looking for other survivors. And we have his writings where he was writing down where he literally thought he was the last person on earth. So this is like the Walking Dead kind of scale of a disease that's going around. And so this obviously, even after this comes back, even if you are to survive, just the trauma that you have to imagine of seeing just such death on a massive scale is gonna probably have death very present in your mind. And that this is something that we definitely have a big difference between us and people in the Middle Ages. It's hard for us to really understand because we don't think about death. We don't think about really. It's something that is very much put off to the side and really kind of almost taboo to think about. You don't talk about it. You don't really think about it. It's a very awkward subject, but these Europeans in the Middle Ages were very much forced to think about it, where this is a actual reality and something that they encounter every single day. And of course, the Middle Ages life expectancy was much lower. And so your time on earth was much shorter. And so this spiritual reality of there being heaven and hell was something that was much more present and much more felt by the people in the Middle Ages. And so you have this, that I think that's why it would be fair to say to a certain capacity that that's why, that's what so much of the cultural focus was on in the Middle Ages. Just you can tell by the cathedrals that they built, these massive edifices that were the pinnacle of their entire society. And today we have giant skyscrapers, and that kind of represents our priority of our pinnacle of society being business and the economy. But their pinnacle is this cathedral, is this act of worship to God. Because in large part because of that presence of understanding that there is a spiritual reality, and you're gonna when you die, you're either going to heaven or hell, and you might die tomorrow. So it's probably time to be thinking about it right now. And so, I mean, you can, even if you look at some of the cathedrals, you have depictions of like the final judgment in many of them. And that's kind of a little bit, I think Catholics in some way are a little bit more morbid than Protestants in many ways. I remember growing up at our nearby parish at St. Vincent de Paul. There was, in the back of the church, there's this very scary looking skeleton that's kind of like, it's part of the glass art, where this skeleton is kind of like, his hands are outstretched, and he's kind of had this creepy looking grin, and there's all these bodies kind of like falling down underneath his arms. And that represents, final judgment, this idea that at your death, you have an account for what you've done. And so the church, has always, from the beginning, obviously from the beginning with Christ and throughout the ages, has very much emphasized that judgment is something that's real and it's going to happen, but it doesn't leave us alone to kind of fend for ourselves in that. And so, of course, the church has fought hard to educate people and to be able to raise them in the faith and in laws of morality and kind of how to abide and to follow God's law and God's will. But it really, in the Middle Ages, this idea of indulgences started to surface a little bit more. And it became kind of a bigger thing than originally it was, and definitely bigger than we kind of think of it as today. Because as today as Catholics, we still have indulgences. It's definitely not as big of a deal. But really, if you think, having this understanding of the Middle Ages and of the Black Death and all of this presence of the other reality, indulgences is kind of something that was much more important and present in people's minds. So let's think about a little bit of what an indulgence. I want to look up the definition of what is an indulgence for our audience who might not be familiar with the term. And so have right here, an indulgence is the extra sacramental remission of the temporal punishment due and God's justice to sin that has been forgiven, which remission is granted by the church in the exercise of the power of the keys. Okay, so that's saying that there's in the Bible, there is this part of the Bible where Jesus says to St. Peter, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of the netherworld will not prevail. So Peter has this in the Bible and in tradition. We have this idea of Peter holding the keys to heaven and being able to, and he says, whatever you bind on earth will be bound, and whatever you loose on, will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. So this idea of Christ being present with his church and giving his church actual authority to actually effectuate change in these things. So this indulgences very much comes from that biblical idea of the church being able to bind and loose things on earth that affect heaven as well. But if you notice, an important detail right here is that it's a remission of the temporal punishment. So it's not saying it's not a forgiveness of sin, because it said it's only a forgiveness for sin which has already been. No, it's a forgiveness of the punishment of sin for that sin that's already been forgiven. So that's an important detail to remember, because very soon this, there's not the kind of centralization that we have today. So very soon this idea of indulgences starts getting very mixed up, and to the point that even like many parish priests in different villages didn't really know what an indulgence was. And so very quickly you kind of have this unfortunate circumstance of people abusing indulgences left and right. And this becomes a bigger and bigger problem. And when you kind of, and what, Martin Luther ended up having a problem was more with the Pope and the bishops kind of using indulgences in what was perceived as the wrong way. I might be getting ahead of myself. Do you have any questions before we go on?
Well, I think it's important to clarify the distinction you're making between a sin that has been forgiven, and then the punishment, the temporal punishment that attaches to our soul from that sin. I think you can't really understand that concept without first saying, well, there's a Catholic belief in purgatory, which is something that Protestants don't have. They don't have that belief. And we could go into like the scriptural reasons why Catholics believe in purgatory and answer some dilemmas that Protestants might present to Catholics for such a belief. But I don't think that's the point of this podcast. Let's just say, let's focus on the indulgences, and let's just say, so Catholics have this belief that there's a liminal space that's outside of the gates of heaven where souls can reside, should they not merit hell, so to speak, and yet not yet be ready for paradise. There's this idea that there's a place of purification that souls can reside in, and that's purgatory. And that's where they're in that for a set time, where they're purified so that they might enter heaven at some point. So there's still an idea of time in this space. I think you can say that time is dispensed with on in heaven and in hell because they're forever. But in purgatory, there's still a sense of heading towards some point. It's not like hours and minutes, but there's a period of time. And that's important because that's how indulgences started, was the idea of a temporal release of time from this space of purification by good things that you can do here on earth. Does that kind of set the stage a little bit, Peter?
Right. And indulgences, it was kind of something that the church granted and gave to people out of, I forget what the term is used, but it's kind of the storehouse of graces that the church has. And that's because of the salvation won by Christ on the cross. And also, so
I think it's important to note too there at this point is the church is thought of as, we say as Catholics, Holy Mother Church. We think of church as mother. And so the church has a role, like just any mother who wishes to give good things to her children. The church also has this desire to give good things, to give gifts to her children. And that's how we see this indulgence, is it's a gift from our Holy Mother Church.
Right. And from the beginning, this idea of indulgences and granting indulgences was that it had to be done with the right mindset in order to be effective. It had to be done with a spirit of devotion and fervor for God. So let's say you couldn't, originally this idea that you couldn't make a donation to the church, to build, a big basilica or something, with completely just covered in mortal sin and living a life, let's say, of debauchery of some sort, and then expect for that indulgence to be effective to you. That is not the teaching of the church. But that's not to say that that was never done or never understood to be the case. And I think that it's pretty fair to say that with the lack of understanding in many different parts of Europe, and the actual teaching of the church, that it was probably being abused quite often. And so when you have people like Martin Luther, like looking at that, and Martin Luther, he's an interesting character himself too, because he is just completely obsessed with guilt, completely crippled, in fact, by the sense of guilt and not being able to achieve salvation in any way. And when he kind of looks at this idea of indulgences being abused by people within the church, that's something that is, it's obviously it's unacceptable. It's true that that's unacceptable. But of course, his solution is to tear everything down, which is not what we understand to be the proper solution. But indulgences, it's messy, right? It was very misunderstood then, as it can be very misunderstood today. And so it leads to, it's one of the, I guess, major things that leads to Martin Luther to, nail his 95 theses to the doors of the cathedral in Germany. Is setting off in large part the Protestant Reformation. I'm not super familiar with, I'm not remembering too much Calvin right now or the other reformers, what their problems were with indulgences. Do you recall that at all?
I believe that Calvin had no space for indulgences at all. I don't have the writing at my fingertips, but Calvin had a firm belief in predestination. Therefore, there's no need to have some sort of temporal relief from the punishment or the stain of sin if you believe in predestination, because it doesn't matter. That doesn't, it has that.
Right.
There is no stain on the predestined. So
they're good or bad. Yeah.
Calvin would have no space for it. I do want to note a little bit something about Luther, and this is a little bit of an aside, so forgive me, but I think it's interesting to speak about. I was watching a Daily Wire Backstage, which I do with great relish. I very much enjoy it. And it was one that in the past few weeks where all the guys started arguing about pornography. And it was very interesting because all the Catholics and Candace Owens were saying that it's wrong to do pornography. It's not normal. And that no wife should stand for a husband that uses pornography, or no woman that's in a relationship with a man, that they saw it very much as cheating. And not saying that you should leave your husband. That's not what Candace and the Catholics were saying. So Catholics would be Matt Walsh and Michael Knowles. And the Ben Shapiro was somewhat in this camp, but not completely. But the two Protestants, the God King, lowercase g, what's his name?
Jeremy Boring.
Jeremy Boring was the most vehement of this camp, but Ben and Clavin were also saying this. They said how every man uses pornography. You just have to expect it. Like that's just the natural state of man, is to use pornography. And it really bothered me. I mean, there's a little bit of a reduction in their argument there, but that's basically the gist of what they said, is that they're not saying that it's right, but that women should just expect that, because that every man is going to use pornography. And Jeremy went so far as to say, if you run into a man that says he hasn't used pornography, then that man is lying. Which is very strong language. And it really bothered me because I couldn't understand why you want to make that. Why do you want to make that argument? What is it that is so important that you say, like, everybody uses pornography? And I think it's caught up quite a bit. I mean, I don't think there's any accident that it was the Protestants that were saying that. And then Ben was there a little bit, but Ben was not really, I think he was more just backing up Jeremy than anything. The Protestants have, ever since Luther, some sort of sad, I mean, I'm not trying to belittle Protestants at all, but it's an odd thing where there's that they make fun of Catholics for being guilty, having Catholic guilt. And I think indulgences, you can use that argument to say that Catholics have Catholic guilt. But I think the point of indulgences is that sin is not normal. That if you are to sin, there is a state of your soul that you lose. Like there's a reality inside you that changes. And I think the Protestants strike at that because there's this feeling like that state, like that sense of normalcy that Catholics have, that it's normal to not sin, is unattainable. You can't reach that. And so because of that, they have to strike away. They're like, well, God in his mercy would never create beings that were just doomed to failure, you know? And Catholics have this very like, okay, no, this is possible. It's normal to not sin. And if you do, then you have that consequence. So I think you can see that today, this sort of Lutheran idea that comes through quite a bit. And it's not even, I don't think it's even a sense of doctrine that's different. It's a sense of almost despair that you see where, no, yeah, like everyone uses pornography. It's just something that happens, and you can't expect the difference. Or everyone is depraved, and you just can't expect anything but depravity from humankind. And Catholics have this idea where we can be better than this, and here are some ways that we can attach ourselves to higher things, you know, if we are to fall. What do you make of that?
I think I couldn't agree more. We, as Catholics, we have this understanding of the church. We see the church as, it's one of the symbols of the church is a hospital, right? It's a hospital for souls. I mean, I kind of see it in the way that, you know, sickness is, it's very common and it occurs. So, you know, bodily sickness, different illnesses, but that is not the natural state of being. That's not the natural state of a body, right? The natural state is to be healthy and whole. And when you are sick, there's something that's wrong. And you don't want to just accept that state of being. you want to, if you accept it, that's a throwing up your hands in despair and saying, this is just the way that it is. That's not the mentality. I think that's good and healthy to have. Good mentalities to have that. I want to heal. I want to get better. There's something that, maybe you won't be able to ultimately completely get better, but our understanding in this context of the Catholic Church being a hospital as a place that you can go and hear the idea of indulgences. The church is offering kind of a path towards healing. And again, indulgences is not forgiveness of sin. It's hinges on repentance and being willing to amend your ways. So it's hinging on that idea of that the sin, it has been forgiven. And I think, of course, that's also a major difference between Catholics and Protestants, is that we do have the Sacrament of Confession as something that we really heavily emphasize as something that, I have obviously many Protestant friends, and the idea of confession is completely just not there, and that's, again, not to diminish that relationship that they have with God, but we see the church as something that we can go to have God's forgiveness. And so, I think that totally agree with that idea of it's not something that's, do we just accept as everybody has this, everybody does this. It's not the natural, even if almost everybody does it, it's not the natural state of being. It's not something that we can just accept as, this is how it is.
And the fact that it's not normal means that there's real repercussions, both spiritually and here in the now spiritually, and then in the future spiritually. That's the idea. So in the now, suppose you repent, you say I'm sorry, I messed up. And you go to the priest and you say, I'm sorry, I messed up. Well, there's still this idea that despite the fact that you have repented of your sin, there is a repercussion from this missing of the mark. That's what sin is. You miss the mark. And so because you've missed, there is some sort of deviation inside spiritually that needs to be ironed out, purified. There's that idea that they have of in the early church, where if someone committed the sin of apostasy or some sort of serious mortal sin, they were excommunicated from the faith. They were removed from the faithful. And suppose they repented and they want to return to the faithful, then there's that idea that this is literally how it was in the early church. They were kneeling and praying for the people that are entering the churches, asking for their indulgences, and the indulgence would be some sort of act that the faithful would perform, some sort of pious act for these people, allowing them. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think, we could have a whole other podcast about excommunication too, because I think there might be a good argument that could be made to bring back excommunication as something a little bit more used. I think that there came a point definitely in the medieval church where even, excommunication was also itself being abused and used kind of as a vindictive political tool. But just the idea of excommunication is actually very important because, again, the spiritual reality is real. If you die in the state of mortal sin, you're going to hell, and that is ultimate despair. And so the church, that you have this idea of the church, it excommunicated someone. And if you're not familiar with excommunication, it's this idea that the church declares you out of the commune, out of communion. You're out of commune with the Catholic Church, out of commune with salvation. And so if you remain in that state, then you cannot attain salvation. And so I think that it's kind of an important concept to have, because it's the church basically giving you a last warning, saying you are in major trouble. And it's not because we are angry at you, it's because of your sin. And if you persist in these ways, this is the gravity of what you're doing. And so I think that, you could definitely have a good argument to be made that we should kind of emphasize that a little bit more, not out of this idea of vindictiveness, but out of mercy, really, because it's making really that the urgency of that reality more present to people's minds. What do you think?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think this is going to be coming back. I think the amount of scandal that is caused on a daily basis by public Catholics, well, the Holy Mother Church is going to have to start looking out for her children by starting excommunication again. There's too much public scandal. Too many people are being confused by this public scandal. So I think it's a matter of time.
Yeah. I mean, I think that brings us to, though, the Catholic Reformation. There was this point, kind of going back to our theme of indulgences. There comes a point also, along with excommunication, where indulgences are being abused, and there's this huge misunderstanding throughout the church of what we actually mean. And unfortunately, for many, it was too late. With Martin Luther setting off the Lutheran movement and this kind of fire that kind of spread in this massive internal civil war in Christendom of Protestantism and Catholicism, actually going to physical war for quite a number of years. We're also blessed that there was a Protestant Reformation and there was a Catholic Reformation that followed, in which we have some of the great saints arising who are returning this, acknowledging the problems and the cracks within the church. I always love to think of, Saint Francis and that dream that the Pope had of him, where the church is the great pillars are cracking and it's running up and it's just getting out of control, and the church starts to crumble and fall. And then Saint Francis comes in and he's like holding the church from falling down. That's how I see the Catholic Reformation, where it's this restoration of the full and the fullness of the truth, the full understanding of God's teaching, and then a better understanding of it as well. And that's something that I think we touched on a little bit last episode, where we have so much to be grateful for living in today, because we are built on the shoulders of giants, on figures of like Saint Francis and Saint Thomas Aquinas, who have come before us and have broadened and deepened our understanding. So that's what we can use as a starting point. The discoveries and the breakthroughs that they made are our starting point, so that we can continue to deepen our understanding of the truth. And so it's a beautiful thing. I'm very grateful for it.
Absolutely. It's gorgeous.
Yeah. I think that probably want to be closing up for today, unless you had any final thoughts or any more things you wanted to discuss.
Well, definitely. I think a big point that you've brought up so well, that I'm coming out of here with a deeper appreciation for, is a greater appreciation for this fixation that we have on Halloween. You made the point, and it's correct. We never think about death in our culture. Death is such a distant thing, and we're living longer and longer. There's really no reason to, unless it's, March 2020, and then all of a sudden everyone's freaking out because we could die. And I don't want to belittle it. I don't want to belittle it, but I mean, you can make that. You can make that. That could happen to you stepping outside your door. At any point in time, a tree could fall on you. It happens to people. People die. But in any case, we don't think about it very much. And yet we, as a culture, Halloween is becoming more and more popular. We keep on thinking of like people, our neighborhood is chock full of skeletons and ghouls right now. This is a great moment for us to step back and remember our impending mortality. Like, we are mortal, our impending doom, it approaches. And those skeletons that we had, like that you talked about in the back of St. Vincent de Paul, a lot of people don't notice that. But this is a great time to think about it now, when you have it in every street lawn, and the fact that us as Catholics, death holds no sting. Sin is, there's real repercussions for sin. But just to recap, in baptism, your soul is made clean, right? So you're completely white. But then you miss the mark in your journey here on earth, and you sin, and that has a real repercussion. Your soul becomes less ready with each sin for heaven. And yet the church gives you, through these pious means where it's some sort of physical act or prayer, which you detach yourself from sin and bind yourself to God. That's what religion is. Religare, you bind yourself to God. Through that practice, which the church attaches real gifts to, you remove that stain of sin from your soul and you start to prepare yourself more and more for heaven. And it's a gorgeous, beautiful thing. Like, this is a wonderful time here when we're seeing death at every door, literally, through all these little yard signs to prepare for it. So thank you for doing that.
Looking at the neighborhoods, like my neighborhood too, has, giant skeletons all over the place and all these, scary symbols of death. It's an interesting thing to realize that, culture is actually pretty fascinated by this. And I think the church for a long time has kind of thought, as the reason that we kind of less emphasize it is because, people don't want to hear that message. That's going to drive people away from the church doors. Just looking at the neighborhood, that's not the case. People do want to hear that message. And they are fascinated by this. So if you tell them the fullness of the truth, this full understanding of the spiritual reality and your path and your hope, your real hope for salvation, I think that's going to be a message that really resonates with a lot of people.
And lucky for me, because every art piece that I create has something to do with death. Death, it's a fascinating bit of story, because death separates the physical, from our journey. It becomes a spiritual journey. And so there's a reality here that it fascinates, and obviously I don't look forward to anyone dying. No, that's not what the fascination is. And that's not why people are so fascinated with death, as we approach Halloween. But anything that is important holds our interest, and so therefore Halloween holds our interest because of the import that it carries beneath the surface. But I wanted to ask before we close. So I made an effort to sum up Indulgences. Can you sum up as well for the people? Because I think it's a very tricky topic. And we've spoken now for maybe 30, 40 minutes. And I want to make sure people can walk away and actually understand. And let's leave the definition. Anyone can Google New Advent Indulgences and take a look at that. But tell me, Peter, what is Indulgences, as if I had never heard of the term before, in closing?
Well, if you will humor me, I will reference New Advent just a little bit, because I actually just remember that they have the translation for, so indulgence comes from a Latin word, indulgentia, which means to be kind or tender. And I think that really gets at the heart of what an indulgence is, because it's the church's kindness to the faithful and allowing them, I would say, extra graces, so that there is this reassurance, this kindness is kind of holding the faithful close after you have repented from your sins and you have vowed to amend your ways, and that you're truly striving for to better yourself in your ways. This indulgence is kind of a way of the church holding you close and kind of offering you a path to not only forgiveness, but also comfort from the hurt that you've brought to yourself through sin. And that's kind of how I would kind of present what an indulgence is.
That makes sense. And if we want to find the first indulgence was in the Bible, and it was the good repentant thief. God says, "In this day you will be with me in paradise." So it wasn't just his, as Catholics, we would say, well, he's going to go to purgatory because he's a thief. His soul is bound up in the sins that he created. Like, we actually believe he wasn't framed. He really was a bad guy. But we also believe that Christ's word of saying, you will be with me in paradise, was that first indulgence that was granted, where his soul was cleansed of that stain of sin that had attached to it by him missing the mark over and over throughout his life. And so he's forgiven, and then his soul is purified, made ready for heaven through Christ's word there on the cross. And of course, his act of saying, remember me, is a perfect example. Like we could, like, if we want to go throughout our day, you know, remembering the cross, kissing the cross, or asking God on the cross to remember us, that's a great indulgence right there. So I'm glad, Peter, thank you for leading us on this little indulgence quest.
Well, thank you. I think we have a lot of good stories to tell on this topic. I think that, like you were saying, you have it really in all of the stories that you've told. And I think that you can be rest assured that these themes and these ideas definitely play a central role in the stories that we tell as Catholic filmmakers and Catholic artists. And we hope that all of you enjoyed this journey. Thank you, JP, and thank you for this wonderful conversation. We are the Pinedo Brothers, Catholic filmmakers and artists working to revitalize the world of Catholic art. Did you have any final notes? I don't want to rush out too much. All right. Thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to see you next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Pinedo Brothers Podcast, an artist podcast for Catholics. We hope you enjoyed it, and if so, please consider subscribing, and commenting below. That really helps. This episode was edited and recorded by me, JP. Makeup was done by no one, if you couldn't tell. For more information on us, check us out at pinedobrothers.com. Thanks again.